Imagine you own a house. You built it. You protected it through wars. Your grandfather's name is on the deed, and then one morning your neighbor knocks on the door, hands you a check, and your own government says, give him the keys, and if you dare protest, you get arrested. That is not a movie plot. That is what happened to Egypt, and the Red Sea will never be the same because of it. This is the story of how the most powerful Arab nation in history, a country that held the line against Israel in 3 wars, that controls the Suez Canal, that sits at the crossroads of the entire world, quietly started handing over the keys to its most vital waterway. Not because it wanted to, but because it had no choice left. By the time you finish listening to this, you will understand something that most people in the world have completely missed. The Red Sea is no longer Egypt's sea. And the real question is not how this happened. The real question is what happens next, and why it terrifies everyone in the region. Let's go back to where this started, because this is not a new story. It is a very old wound that has never fully healed. There are 2 small islands sitting right at the mouth of the Gulf of Aqaba. Their names are Tiran and Sanafir. You can miss them on a map if you blink. Tiran is about 80 square kilometers. Sanafir is even smaller, around 33 square kilometers. Together, they look like 2 specks of sand floating in the sea. But do not be fooled by their size. These 2 specks of sand are arguably the most strategically important pieces of land in the entire Middle East. Most people who have never studied the Red Sea have never even heard of these islands. They are uninhabited. There are no cities on them, no airports, no roads, just coral reefs, desert terrain, and the remains of an old military post. A visiting tourist, if they ever made it out there by boat, would see nothing that looks like the center of a geopolitical earthquake. But appearances are everything in the world of strategy. And in this part of the world, the smallest thing, the narrowest passage, the most forgotten island, the most overlooked stretch of water, can hold an entire region hostage. Here is why. The Gulf of Aqaba connects to 4 countries: Egypt, Saudi Arabia, Israel, and Jordan. The only way in or out of that gulf is through a narrow channel called the Strait of Tiran. And sitting right in the middle of that channel, like a natural gate, are Tiran and Sanafir. Whoever controls those islands controls who gets in and who gets out. They control Israel's only Red Sea port in Eilat. They control Jordan's only port at Aqaba. They hold Egypt's southern Sinai coast at their mercy. And they command the entire northern approach to the Red Sea. This is not just geography. This is military leverage. This is trade power. This is the kind of location that empires have fought and died for across centuries. Egypt understood this very well. As far back as 1906, during the final years of the Ottoman Empire, Egypt established formal administration over both islands. Egypt told the United Nations Security Council in 1954 in clear and exact language that Tiran and Sanafir were sovereign Egyptian territory, occupied by Egypt since 1906, administered continuously, and part of Egypt's defensive system during the Second World War. Egyptian forces on those islands cooperated with the Egyptian Air Force and naval units protecting Allied shipping in the Red Sea. That is not the record of a country that was just borrowing someone else's land. That is the record of a country that built its entire southern defense around those 2 islands. And then came 1967. Egyptian President Gamal Abdel Nasser made a decision that would shake the entire world. He closed the Strait of Tiran to Israeli shipping. He blocked the only route to Israel's southern port. And that single act, closing those waters, was the final trigger that started the 6-Day War. Israel considered it an act of war. It launched a lightning strike that captured the Sinai Peninsula, the West Bank, Gaza, the Golan Heights, and yes, Tiran and Sanafir. In 6 days, the entire strategic picture of the Middle East changed, and the world understood in those 6 days exactly how powerful those 2 small islands really were. They were not just land, they were the switch that could turn a region's lights off. Israel held Tiran until 1979. The Egypt-Israel peace treaty at Camp David returned the islands to Egyptian control. And crucially, the Camp David Accords, signed by Egypt, Israel, and the United States, specifically referenced Tiran and Sanafir by name. The treaty established a multinational peacekeeping force on the islands to guarantee freedom of navigation. Any change to that status required Israel's approval, which raises the question that even a Berlin librarian asked a researcher years later when shown the old maps. If these islands were Saudi territory, why was Saudi Arabia not part of that agreement? Why was it Egypt that signed? Why was it Egypt that gave guarantees? Why was it Egypt that got the islands back? The answer is simple: because they were Egyptian. Saudi Arabia had a different story, and they never stopped telling it. Riyadh argued that in 1950, the islands were temporarily handed to Egypt for protection, because Saudi Arabia had no navy capable of defending them against Israeli expansion. The Saudi argument was that the handover was never a transfer of sovereignty. It was a security arrangement. Egypt was just the caretaker. Egypt strongly rejected this version of history, but in 2016 something happened that changed everything. And it did not happen because of history, it happened because of money. Egypt was in crisis, a deep, suffocating economic crisis that had been building since the 2011 revolution, accelerating after the military coup of 2013 and spiraling by 2016 into something that threatened the stability of the entire country. The Egyptian pound was losing value. Inflation was rising. Foreign currency reserves were shrinking. The country needed investment desperately, immediately, and in enormous amounts. The government of President Abdel Fattah el-Sisi had been promising economic recovery for years, but the recovery was not coming fast enough, and the pressure was building. Egypt is not a small country. It is 110 million people, the most populous nation in the Arab world and one of the most populous in Africa. Feeding that population, keeping the lights on, maintaining the military, paying the civil service, servicing the foreign debt, all of this requires money that Egypt was running out of. The Suez Canal was the crown jewel, Tau. Tourism was another major source of income, but neither of those alone was enough to close the gap. The government needed foreign investment at a scale that only Gulf money could deliver, and in the Gulf, the biggest wallet belonged to Saudi Arabia. Saudi Arabia had been one of the most important backers of Sisi's government since the very beginning, since the coup in 2013 that brought him to power. Riyadh saw Sisi as a stabilizing force against political Islam and the Muslim Brotherhood. It had poured billions of dollars into Egypt in the years after the coup. That history meant that when Saudi King Salman arrived in April 2016 with a check in hand and a request attached, Sisi could not easily say no. He had built his entire government, in part, on Saudi support. Then Saudi King Salman arrived in Cairo in April 2016. He did not come empty-handed. He came with a multi-billion-dollar aid package, investments, soft loans, and financial support that Egypt badly needed. And in exchange, Sisi announced something that stunned the entire country. He announced that Egypt was transferring the islands of Tiran and Sanafir to Saudi Arabia. He announced it on the same day as a national holiday, marking Israel's withdrawal from Sinai in 1982. The timing felt deliberate. The message felt like a slap. The reaction in Egypt was immediate and explosive. Egyptians took to the streets in protests that were, by the standards of the Sisi government, remarkably bold. People chanted, "Egyptian, Egyptian," in the streets. Legal experts called it unconstitutional. Opposition figures called it treason. Historians said the president was rewriting history with a pen dipped in Saudi money. The protests were significant. They were the largest public demonstrations Egypt had seen since the removal of Mohamed Morsi in 2013. People were furious, and they were right to be furious. Egypt's courts agreed with them. In January 2017, the High Administrative Court issued a ruling that was extraordinary in its clarity. The court confirmed Egypt's sovereignty over both islands. The government, the court said, had failed to provide any evidence that the islands ever belonged to Saudi Arabia. The Egyptian state, it said, had merely been a custodian argument, not a legitimate historical basis for transfer. The court declared the deal void. It forbade the government from ceding the islands. Some of the judges who signed that ruling became heroes overnight. People celebrated them in the streets. They had stood up to the executive. They had said no. Sisi was not moved. He went on television. He told the Egyptian people to listen to me only on this issue. He dismissed the courts. He insisted the islands originally belonged to Saudi Arabia. He said he was simply giving back what was theirs. Behind the scenes, the crackdown began. Dozens of activists were arrested. Ordinary social media users who posted that Tiran and Sanafir are Egyptian were taken in for questioning. Journalists were silenced. The digital space was policed. A question of national sovereignty became a crime to speak about. In June 2017, Sisi forced the deal through Egypt's parliament, doing it on a national holiday, when public attention was elsewhere. The Speaker of the House dismissed the court rulings, saying judicial decisions meant nothing in this matter. The House Committee on Defense and National Security unanimously approved the transfer. The full Parliament passed it the same day, and on June 24, 2017, Sisi signed it into law. Egypt's own constitution prohibited the transfer of sovereign territory. He signed it anyway. For the first time in modern Egyptian history, a president openly gave away part of the country, and then jailed people for saying so. But here's where the story gets even more complicated, because the transfer was not actually finished. And that unfinished business has become one of the most dangerous tensions in the entire Arab world today. For a formal transfer of sovereignty to be complete under the Camp David framework, Egypt and Saudi Arabia needed to exchange formal letters confirming the handover. Those letters also needed to address the security arrangements tied to the multinational peacekeeping force that had been stationed on the islands since 1979. This is where everything stalled, because the security arrangements required a negotiation between Egypt, Saudi Arabia, and Israel. And that negotiation hit a wall. Saudi Arabia wanted to place surveillance cameras on Tiran and Sanafir. cameras that they wanted to coordinate with Israel, cameras whose range, according to Egyptian government sources speaking to the independent outlet Madamazer, would expose the entire Sinai Peninsula. Egypt's national security establishment said that was unacceptable. The Sinai is Egypt's most sensitive military zone, already partly demilitarized under the Camp David Treaty. Allowing cameras with full Sinai coverage, cameras coordinated with Israel, was something Egypt's military could not accept, no matter what Sisi had signed on paper. Israel formally approved the island transfer in July 2022. U.S. President Joe Biden, during his visit to Riyadh that year, confirmed that American peacekeepers would leave Tiran by the end of 2022, one of the required steps to finalize the transfer. But the letters were still not sent. The final handover was still not complete. And as of early 2026, years after Sisi signed the deal, the sovereignty transfer remains legally unfinished. The tension between Riyadh and Cairo over this issue had quietly become one of the biggest cracks in the Arab world's supposed unity. And then, in April 2025, the stakes went up dramatically. Reports emerged, confirmed by multiple Egyptian government officials speaking to Madamazer, that Saudi Arabia had proposed something extraordinary. Riyadh offered to allow the United States AS to establish a military base on the islands of Tiran and Sanafir. The stated purpose of the base was to allow U.S. forces to secure the Suez Canal and prevent ships suspected of carrying weapons to Gaza or Lebanon, particularly those coming from Iran, from entering the waterway. Egypt's response within its own government was divided. Some officials flatly rejected the idea. Others said Egypt was not in a position to simply say no to Saudi Arabia, and that Cairo might have to find a way to extract concessions before accepting. The second option was being seriously considered. One Egyptian official confirmed that Egypt's foreign many. Hister discussed activating a Red Sea security forum before a planned Trump visit to Riyadh in May 2025, where a series of Red Sea agreements were expected to be signed. One of the main goals of those agreements, according to Egyptian officials, was for Saudi Arabia to receive formal American protection against any attack on the kingdom. Think about what this means. The islands that Egypt gave to Saudi Arabia under financial pressure are now being offered by Saudi Arabia as a platform for American military presence, aimed in part at controlling traffic through Egypt's own Suez Canal. Egypt gave up the islands. And now those islands may be used to watch Egypt's most valuable economic asset. To understand why Egypt cannot simply push back, you have to understand what has happened to Egypt's economy. And the number that explains it all is this: 60%. In 2023, Egypt's Suez Canal generated a historic high of $10.25 billion in annual revenue. That was a record. Egypt was proud of it. The Suez Canal was Egypt's golden artery, the source of hard currency that kept the country running, paid for wheat imports that fed 110 million people, and helped service a foreign debt that had reached $164.5 billion. The canal accounted for roughly 10% of world trade. Over 26,000 ships passed through it in 2023 alone. Then, the Houthis started attacking ships in the Red Sea. Starting in November 2023, the Houthi movement in Yemen, backed by Iran, began targeting commercial vessels they claimed were linked to Israel. Within weeks, the world's largest shipping companies started making a calculation. Was it safer to risk a Houthi missile, or to sail around the entire continent of Africa via the Cape of Good Hope? The answer, for most of them, was to go around Africa. Ships started disappearing from the Suez Canal. Traffic dropped, and Egypt watched its golden artery run dry. By the end of 2024, only 13,213 ships had passed through the Suez Canal, a 50% drop from the year before. Revenue collapsed from over $10 billion to just under $4 billion. Egypt had lost more than $6 billion in a single year. The Egyptian pound, which had already lost more than two-thirds of its value against the dollar in recent years, came under even more pressure. Inflation peaked at 38% in September 2023. Egypt's debt-to-GDP ratio stood at 93%, one of the highest in the developing world, leaving the government almost no room to absorb shocks. The IMF stepped in with an $8 billion emergency loan in March 2024, but the conditions were painful. The Egyptian pound was devalued again by 40% in a single day. This is the Egypt that is trying to negotiate with Saudi Arabia, an Egypt that lost over $6 billion from its canal in a single year, an Egypt whose currency has lost most of its value, an Egypt that imports 13 million tons of wheat a year and relies on subsidized bread to keep more than 70% of its population fed, an Egypt that desperately needs Gulf investment, Gulf loans, Gulf political cover. This is not a negotiation between equals, and everyone in the room knows it. Saudi Arabia understands its leverage, and Saudi Arabia, under Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman and his Vision 2030 transformation plan, is pursuing something far bigger than just two small islands. Riyadh is building itself into the dominant power of the Red Sea, and the entire corridor from the Gulf of Aden to the Suez approach. Vision 2030 is Saudi Arabia's plan to transform from an oil-dependent economy into a diversified economic powerhouse. At its heart is the Red Sea coast. Saudi Arabia's most ambitious megaproject, NEOM, a futuristic planned site, spanning 26,500 square kilometers, sits right on the Red Sea coast in the northwest of the kingdom. The kingdom wants its western coast to become a global tourism hub. It wants Red Sea shipping lanes to anchor new logistics and trade networks. It wants to build Saudi Arabia into a transcontinental shipping hub, connecting Asia, Africa, and Europe through Jeddah's ports. The Public Investment Fund, Saudi Arabia's sovereign wealth fund, had assets exceeding $900 billion as of early 2025, and it was channeling those resources aggressively into infrastructure that all depends on Red Sea stability. Jeddah's Islamic port was being upgraded to compete with Dubai and Abu Dhabi as a transcontinental shipping center. Saudi Arabia was signing trade and logistics agreements across the Horn of Africa, building port infrastructure in Somalia, and competing with the UAE for influence in Sudan, Eritrea, and Djibouti. Riyadh was investing in multiple corridors, east to India, west to Africa, and north through Iraq and Syria to Turkey. All of these routes converged on one geographical reality, the Red Sea. Control the Red Sea, and you control the arteries of Saudi Arabia's entire economic future. And to control the Red Sea, you needed to control the waters around Tiran and Sanafir. This is why Saudi Arabia needs Tiran and Sanafir, not as a trophy, not out of historical pride, but as operational infrastructure for $1 trillion economic transformation. Whoever controls those islands controls the gateway through which Saudi Arabia's entire western coast economic vision must flow, and that is not something Riyadh is willing to leave in someone else's hands, even a close ally like Egypt. In June 2025, Egypt's own transport minister, Kamel al-Wazir, confirmed that planning for the Moses Bridge was complete and construction could begin at any time. The Moses Bridge, named after the biblical parting of the Red Sea, is a 32-kilometer causeway that would physically link Saudi Arabia's coast at Ras Hamid with Egypt's Sinai Peninsula at Sharm el-Sheikh, fully financed by Saudi Arabia, built to Saudi Arabia's requirement. Running right through the Strait of Tiran, the same strait that Egypt once used to start a war by closing it. Saudi Arabia is building a permanent physical structure through it, a bridge that will literally connect the two continents, Asia and Africa, under Saudi funding and on Saudi terms. Enormous military spending required to continue its war in Ukraine. At $60, Russia starts drawing down its national savings fund. At $50, Russia starts facing the kind of economic crisis that historically leads to political instability. The price of Russia's Urals crude had already dropped more than 20% since the start of 2025, falling below that critical $60 level. So suddenly, the Saudi Arabia that had been widely described as betraying America to help Russia in 2022 was now the country quietly but effectively crushing the Russian economy in 2025. Not with tanks or diplomatic sanctions or public condemnations, but with oil, with the same weapon it had used against everyone else, simply by pumping more of it. The weapon that Saudi Arabia had once turned against American shale producers was now pointed at Moscow. And the thing that makes this both fascinating and genuinely important is that Saudi Arabia was not doing this for America. It was doing it because Trump had asked for lower prices, because Saudi Arabia wanted a stronger strategic relationship with Washington that would give it access to technology and investment, and because Saudi Arabia was engaged in a long-term battle for global market share against every other producer on Earth simultaneously. This brings us to the deepest truth at the center of everything you have just heard. What looks like betrayal from the outside is actually something much more calculated, much more consistent, and much more revealing than a simple act of disloyalty. Saudi Arabia has never been a traditional ally, not in the way the word is usually meant. It has always been a strategic partner of necessity, a relationship held together by mutually beneficial interests rather than shared values or genuine friendship. The Americans knew this at some level, but they kept acting as though the relationship was something deeper and more durable than the numbers behind it. And every time the numbers changed, they were caught off guard, because they were measuring the relationship in terms of history and sentiment and shared security commitments, while Saudi Arabia was measuring it purely in terms of oil prices, market share, budget requirements, and the best available deal on the table on any given day. China understood this calculus years before most American policymakers admitted it openly. China has been steadily building its relationship with Saudi Arabia for over a decade, signing energy agreements, building economic partnerships, and positioning itself as a reliable buyer without political conditions attached. Today, China buys more than a quarter of all Saudi oil exports. Saudi Arabia has been quietly exploring the idea of settling some of those trades in Chinese yuan rather than US dollars, a shift that would sound purely technical to most people, but carries enormous geopolitical weight. The entire global oil market has been priced in American dollars since that 1945 agreement in the Great Bitter Lake. The so-called petrodollar system is one of the most important foundations of American global financial dominance. Every country that needs oil must first acquire dollars to buy it. That creates permanent global demand for American currency, permanently supporting American financial power. If Saudi Arabia begins selling significant amounts of oil in yuan, it starts chipping away at that foundation, slowly. But the direction matters. Russia understood the transactional nature of the Saudi relationship perfectly and never expected anything more from it. Putin used the OPEC Plus partnership pragmatically, to buy time, to generate revenue, to demonstrate to the world that Russia was not isolated, to keep the sanctions from being fully effective long enough to stabilize the Russian economy around a war footing. When Saudi Arabia pivoted away in 2025, Russia was hurt economically, be they not diplomatically surprised, because in this world, the only betrayal would be expecting something different from a partner who had always been exactly what it presented itself to be, an independent operator, placing its own interests above all other considerations, always. The United States has spent decades learning this lesson and then somehow forgetting it by the time the next crisis arrives. American policymakers keep assuming that because Saudi Arabia depends on American military protection, it will follow American political and economic leadership. But that assumption misses the other side of the equation. America also depends on Saudi Arabia for oil market stability, for regional security cooperation, for intelligence sharing, for influence across the Arab world, for preventing worse actors from filling the vacuum if the relationship collapsed. Both sides need each other, which means neither side holds all the cards. And when neither side holds all the cards, the relationship is a negotiation, not a command structure. The world order that was built in 1945 on that warship in the Great Bitter Lake is not collapsing overnight, but it is visibly, undeniably changing. The assumption that America protects and Saudi Arabia supplies was a deal designed for a specific historical moment, a moment when America was the sole superpower, when oil dependency was total and there were no alternative sources, and when there were no other major powers with the ability or the interest to offer Saudi Arabia a competing partnership. That moment is long gone. China is fully at the table. Russia, despite its economic difficulties, remains a significant player. And Saudi Arabia has options that it simply did not have in 1945 or 1973 or even in 2000. When you have options, you use them. Not out of ingratitude, not out of hostility. Simply because that is what any rational actor does when the strategic environment changes. The 80-year relationship between America and Saudi Arabia is not over. It will not end. It is too embedded in the structure of global power, too mutually necessary, too practically important to simply dissolve over a disagreement about oil production levels. But it has fundamentally changed in character. It will never again be the automatic, almost unconditional partnership that defined most of the 20th century. From this point forward, every significant decision will be negotiated rather than assumed. Every major deal will be conditional rather than guaranteed. Every alliance will be tested against the only question that Saudi Arabia has clearly decided is the one that truly matters above all others. What does Riyadh get out of this? And in a world where that is the governing question, nobody is a permanent friend. Nobody is a permanent enemy. Every nation is a potential partner for exactly as long as the relationship serves Tezum's national interest. That is not cynicism. That is not moral failure. That is the new, honest, openly admitted reality of global power in a multipolar world where multiple great powers compete for influence simultaneously. And the sooner Washington truly internalizes that reality, not just acknowledges it intellectually in think tank reports, but actually builds its foreign policy around it, the better it will be at maintaining the relationships it needs on terms that actually hold. Because Saudi Arabia did not betray America out of spite or ideology or some grand geopolitical realignment. Saudi Arabia just stopped pretending that the relationship was something it had never actually been. It was always a deal. It was always conditional. It was always about oil and security and money and leverage. And in the new multipolar world where China rises, here America struggles to hold its position. Saudi Arabia is not choosing sides in some great moral conflict. It is sitting exactly where it has always wanted to sit, at the center of the global energy system, holding the tap in its hands, deciding who gets relief and who feels pressure, making itself indispensable to every player simultaneously, and answering to nobody but the interests of the kingdom itself. That is not a betrayal. That is a strategy. A cold, patient, extraordinarily effective strategy that has been running continuously since 1945. The only difference now is that Saudi Arabia is finally willing to let the world see it clearly. And the real question, the question that will define the next decade of global energy and global power, is whether America is finally ready to see it clearly too. Because the countries that understand Saudi Arabia for what it actually is will be far better positioned to work with it than the countries that keep insisting on seeing it as something it never was and never claimed to be. The tap is still in Saudi hands. The question is only who gets the water next. Now let us zoom out even further, because there is a dimension to this story that almost nobody is talking about, and it may be the most important dimension of all. Saudi Arabia is not just playing a game with oil prices and alliances, it is playing a generational game about its own survival. Mohammed bin Salman knows, and every serious Saudi policymaker knows, that oil will not be the center of the global economy forever. The green energy transition is real. Electric vehicles are growing faster than almost any technology in history. Solar and wind power are becoming cheaper every year. The International Energy Agency has projected that global demand for oil could peak within this decade and begin a long, slow decline. Saudi Arabia is sitting on the world's largest reserves of a commodity that the world may eventually stop wanting. And that existential reality shapes every single decision the kingdom makes right now. This is why Saudi Arabia 2030 is not just an economic reform program. It is a survival plan for a civilization built entirely on a resource with an expiration date. Every oil dollar that Mohammed bin Salman can extract at the highest possible price today is a dollar invested in the Saudi economy of tomorrow. In tourism, in technology, in manufacturing, in artificial intelligence, in the entertainment and hospitality industries that will keep the kingdom relevant and prosperous after oil. When Saudi Arabia refused American pressure to lower prices in 2022, it was not just protecting this year's budget. It was protecting the decades-long transformation project that determines whether Saudi Arabia remains a relevant global power in 2050 or becomes a footnote.